Welcome back to Control Alt Lead, where I talk to IT leaders about what is moving in the market and how much is moving in the market today. Lots going on with the Labour election victory, and I'm very lucky to be joined at extremely short notice by Mark Ridley. Mark, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I'm Mark Ridley. I effectively work as an advisory or consulting CTO. So I've been a CTO for almost all of my career, and now I work with lots of different companies, both small and large, across the sector in lots of different industries.
Excellent. And of course, you've worked for some really massive firms, from Reed to Blenheim Chalcott. Yeah, you've got a pretty illustrious career behind you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say illustrious. I've been very lucky. I've had a very lucky career. I got to work with some fantastic businesses. Nothing very very large, but I worked with the Financial Times. I was the technical co-founder of Read.co.uk, the job site, and I've worked with a number of venture companies as well. So I'm relatively experienced in the startup space as well, and obviously that's one of the things that we actually won't hear that much about today because of the manifesto promises about funding for startups, because it tends to have been bigger corporates that I think will benefit from this manifesto.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go into chatting about what the Labour victory means for UK technology. Let's start with startups. Uh, they've been fairly vocal about their support for startups, but you think it's going to be more for the big corporates?
I think it's really interesting for startups. That probably the biggest thing to say about the Labour manifesto as we've seen it, and I know there are particular topics that we can look into around data centers and around AI policies, but I think probably the thing that I saw most around the Labour manifesto, and I think the IFS review, so the Institute of Fiscal Studies review of the Labour manifesto said it best, which was that there's not an enormous amount of substance in there around their promises. So what they've done is they have highlighted a number of really big challenges, most of which aren't really around tech. They've particularly focused on growth as the upside opportunity, but they haven't really made any manifesto promises about where the money is going to go in a way that is usable for us. In the startup world, maybe some of the potential changes around capital gains tax might affect some of the most wealthy people in that investment market, which might have a trickle down impact on how it's going to impact our tech companies. There are some promises around growth and how we can actually trade more easily with Europe and the rest of the world. But there's nothing really in there that I think for startups, and I saw the Tech UK reporting on this, there's not really anything that certainly the smaller businesses, the SMEs, are going to be over the moon about a Labour victory about.
Mhm. They've committed to keeping a lot of the current tax breaks and funding and that kind of thing. So certainly the what was the capex scrapping of tax on capex they've kept, which is very welcome, of course. That was a huge win for the startup sector.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you are right that uh, they have studiously throughout their campaign avoided committing to things, and they've got a lot of criticism for that. Um, but it has meant that there's been no boogeyman for the right to fight. So, or the conservatives to fight, I should say. So yeah, it seems to have worked out for them. But yeah, let's continue talking about the rest of their plans. Just this week, Wes Streeting, who Shadow Health Secretary, probably now going to become the actual Health Secretary, talked about his plans for the NHS app and the Federated Data Platform, which we've talked about a lot of computing. That's the plan to bring together all of the NHS's IT. And Wes Streeting also wants to roll GP data into that because technically GPs are franchisees, they're not part of the NHS. So yeah, big plans there. It's been tried before. We had care.data and the National Programme for IT. What's going to be different this time?
Well, if the cynic in me says nothing, so I saw the coverage of Wes Streeting, I think in Wired,
Wasn't
so I
wide,
saw
yeah.
the interview with him there, and I think if we saw that as not the statement of a politician, but the statement of a CEO, I think all of the CTOs, CIOs listening would probably roll their eyes and say, yes, we've all been in that situation where somebody's come up with a brilliant idea. They've been somewhere and seen something. Because the example that he saw was Singapore. Obviously, a country with a very high tech population, um, money to invest, and it's very different. It's a very different ecosystem to what we have in the UK, which is a crumbling infrastructure. So, whilst the thrust of what Wes Streeting said, I thought was profoundly logical. Obviously, the more that we can do with digital connectivity, if we can connect people to apps, if we can reduce the load on people in the NHS having to manually do those tasks, fantastic. But the point, and exactly to your point, what is going to be different? I suspect nothing, because delivering that type of program is incredibly difficult. And I do think that there is an opportunity um, to address some of these. I haven't worked in the NHS, and I think it'd be fascinating to bring on. You've had some fantastic comment articles, opinion pieces in computing from NHS leaders, but starting smaller, I think, is the way to solve this problem. So break this down. Don't try and solve a national problem. Try and solve a more regional, local problem with standards that are driven from the center. And I think to CTOs, we would look at that and say, yes, break it down, have the standards, have integration. And that is probably the way to start with local successes that roll up to an overall national success. The other thing I think could be very interesting is potentially looking at more of a commitment to open source, which obviously has potential security issues, as we've seen recently with some open source vulnerabilities that have been promulgated around the internet. But actually almost making a commitment that more of the NHS services could be driven by open source technology, and we could, as a nation, contribute back to that, could be a very interesting way of trying to address that problem.
Yeah, that seems to be an easy win with the sort of sheer spread of open source. And what you've just said will certainly make Open UK happy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think technology, as technologists, we look at these problems as systemic problems, and we would like to be involved in solving them. The problem is these are massive problems, and generally governments are thinking in very short-term bursts, and so it's very easy to say let's have an NHS app. Very difficult to make it happen.
Mm. Well, we have the NHS app, and according to the Wired article we both saw earlier this week, 31 million people are using it, and that's great. That's a huge user base. That's almost half the country.
Yeah,
But that's only on the front end, like the sort of consumer facing side. The back
yeah,
end, there's still a huge amount of work to pull all of that data in and make it usable for booking GP appointments, for accessing well, you can already access your medical records on it, but to make it usable by doctors, say. So he wants to make it the central hub. Wes Streeting wants to make it the central hub for the NHS to contact patients. It's a great goal. It's going to need some work, and it's going to need a lot of time.
yeah.
Away from the app and the technology side, the let's just have a quick chat about the federated data platform, because Streeting supports it. He wants to bring GP data into it. He quite strongly said that privacy concerns have been overblown. He wants to make it very transparent about what data is being shared and with whom. He says the privacy fight is a fight Labour are willing to have. So interesting. Like I'd maybe not say it's fighting words, but it's a very clear statement of intent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the best commitment that we can hope for. I think there were concerning overtures that we've had from the Conservatives previously, where, or at least under Conservative government, where it appeared that national health data could have fallen into the hands of private entities, which is obviously very concerning. And I think we cannot go a day at the moment without seeing yet another very, very serious data leak security breach. And there is massive increase in nation state activity. So I know this is a diversion away from the question, but I do think that was evidently missing in almost all of the manifestos. That there was talk of some increase maintenance of security spending. But there are massive nation state threats against the UK now from a cybersecurity standpoint. And I don't think that we as a country are taking that as seriously as we should. And we've seen this with recently, I mentioned the open source threat. So we saw this with Polyfill recently, where it seemed that Polyfill, very famous open source very well used open source component seemed to be being misused by nation state actors. Um, and so obviously that is becoming even more prolific. And it's not just that. We also saw the NHS hospitals subject to a direct what looked like a nation state attack. So with all of this, I'm very concerned about how much spending we are doing as a country to improve our security footprint. And that obviously has to be educating private companies about what they need to do to address that problem.
Well, quite famous, well, infamously, I should say, none of the manifestos really addressed cybersecurity. I think the most mentions of cyber that we had were three in the Liberal Democrat manifesto, and two of those statements were just restating what they'd already said in the introduction. So you are right. None of them were really talking about security or defense in much detail at all. So that's definitely something that we'll have to keep watching.
Yeah.
Moving forward then, because there's a lot to get through and only a limited amount of time, the big topic on every technologist's lips at the moment is AI. Conservatives were very famously light touch on AI regulation. It turns out that that was perhaps one of the good things that they did. It does seem to have been very well received. It seems to be working well for the industry. Whereas, things like the EU AI Act have got more criticism, at least from the industry, if not from the general public. So, what can we expect on AI from Labour? What are you expecting, Mark?
I it's a good question. What am I expecting? I'm not necessarily expecting a lot. I do think that the Conservative policy erred in the right direction, and Rishi Sunak quite rightly said or made a comment that it's very difficult to legislate for something that we don't yet understand. And I think fundamentally that's true. I think there is a an opportunity for AI to be very harmful. But I do think, and I think we've heard the same thing from both Bill Gates and Andrew Ng, who was previously working at Google, a very famous AI researcher and educator, around we have to not assume that AI is anything more than a tool. It is humans that misuse AI. Obviously, it's an overblown term. When we talk about AI, we're really talking about advanced machine learning techniques primarily. I think that what we've seen in Europe, so Europe taking this in the European AI Act, taking this sort of two-step to dual track approach, where they're saying we will legislate against bigger models when they're above a certain threshold, and below a threshold will be lighter to touch, wasn't as well thought through as it could have been. And to an extent, I felt that the potential legislation around AI that was introduced by the Conservatives was more pragmatic. What I think we have to do is understand the technology is moving incredibly quickly, and so the legislation needs to move incredibly quickly. What we don't want is a repeat of the Computer Misuse Act or one of these old pieces of legislation that sticks with us for 20 years. I think anything that Labour do has to be driven by watching and responding quickly to the changes, because new threats will become available about it. That said, I don't think that AI is the biggest threat that we have. I think, or should be a priority area of focus for Labour. I think there are much bigger problems around things like social media, technology monopolies that pose a more direct threat. Not only a more direct threat, but actually a more meaningful threat. So, for instance, there was very little legislation around social media control for younger people. And we know that social media is extremely damaging for when people, teenagers, say under the age of 16, 17, are exposed to social media. So more anxiety, more self-harm, even potentially suicide risk going up because of exposure to social media. And there's very much a lack of legislation around, or at least certainly no hard and fast promises around that in any of the manifestos that I saw, but you may be able to correct me on that.
No, you're right. There's been nothing about that at all, and it's a great point. It perhaps doesn't get the attention that AI does. AI is the flashy new tool, but you're right. Social media is also a dangerous one, or can be a dangerous one. It can be terrible for mental health.
Yeah.
So yeah, we would hope to see something on that. Although every time that social media has been attempted to be legislated against or regulated, big tech has come out against it, and big tech is a powerful lobbying force. it has a lot of money. So, and that's going to come up with any sort of attempt at AI regulation as well.
Yeah, of
You
course.
talked about the need for legislation to move quickly. Now, we did see, perhaps not a commitment, but a promise in the Labour manifesto to establish a regulatory innovation office. And the plan of that is to speed regulation and also updates to current legislation. That is very, very necessary, very important in the current climate, with tech moving as quickly as it does. So I suppose we'll just have to wait and see on the plans for the Regulatory Innovation Office.
Yeah.
Yeah, so excellent answer there. Thank you, Mark. You talked about big tech as well, and then I did. So Labour also said they plan to force tech giants to compensate victims of fraud. So currently that's on banks. So if someone is taken in by a scam and they lose money, then the bank has to compensate them up to a certain limit. Of course, they can't lose £1 million and just go, oh, well, my bad. Hand out money, please, Barclays, thanks. Other banks are available. So but now if someone gets scammed on social media, say, then Labour say they want tech giants to take some responsibility for that, for not protecting people enough. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, it makes complete sense for the people that make most of the money out of providing these services to bear some of the risk, which to date they haven't. I think it can be difficult to decide whether it should be the banks who make lots of money or the social media giants that make lots of money. But
Yeah,
clearly, so my sympathies for either are not overflowing. But I do think it is fair that this risk has been effectively created by the tech monopolies, and they are broadly responsible for how prolific that fraud is. And so I think it is entirely reasonable. So I thought it's a very pragmatic suggestion. It'll be interesting to see how it works in reality. I do think that it would be very nice to see any of the non-UK tech monopolies, by which I obviously mean every tech monopoly, and so you can kind of see the direction that I'm going there, to actually contribute much more towards the economy of the UK. So whether it is, it is in sort of the downside, you need to compensate people for the fraud, or at least play a part in that chain of compensating victims of fraud, or paying tax on earnings. I think it would be nice to see people that weren't tax residents in the UK, companies that weren't tax residents in the UK, contributing more to the UK economy. But there is another point there, which is I would love to see more that is going to help the UK create our own tech giants, not necessarily monopolies, which we have clearly been extremely bad at. And there's also been a risk with one of the other things that seems to be in the Labour manifesto is increasing the amount of foreign direct investment in the UK. That seems to be one of the ways that they are going to leverage that our own pound, and it's not Labour money, it's our money. They want to spend it. So I think the ratio is something like spend £1 of our money, get £3 of private investment, and a lot of that will come from foreign direct investment. But we can't continue to sell off great British businesses, great British infrastructure. We have to, and especially in a global economy which is becoming more fraught, less united, we have to have some of that infrastructure and some of those successes ourselves.
Mm. I wrote quite extensively about this when Jeremy Hunt, who famously this morning held on to his seat with a majority of just 891. That's embarrassingly small, but he managed it. Well done, Jeremy. Anyway, he said a few months ago that he wanted to build a $1 trillion British tech business. Perhaps he should have been laying the groundwork a little while ago before being booted out of power, but that was his goal. Now, $1 trillion is worth more than the entire British tech sector, so it may be a bit of a lofty goal. But the point that I made was that we are addicted to foreign money in the UK. Entrepreneurs grow their businesses and then sell them to Americans or to India or China or whoever. We don't tend to hold on to our businesses here and nurture them and grow them into, something that can compete on the world stage. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Mark. It's a really good point.
And I do think one of the other things that I was sadly missing was there was talk around investment in education, which I think is right. And you and I have spoken about this before, Tom. But I do think that there is a lack of um, acknowledgement of what we need to do in high-tech education. So I complained to you recently about the number of girls that are now taking computing GCSE is falling precipitously. I think it fell from 30% down to 20% over the last 8 years since the introduction of the new curriculum. So it's got worse, primarily because it's seen as, well, in fact, it is demonstrably um, a hard subject. So bar German, it is one of the hardest subjects to get high scores in, and so people are choosing not to do it. Now, what's interesting is when girls are on that course, they are generally very successful, but undervalue their own results. So they think that they're not doing as well as boys tend to do, which is obviously something that we see all the way through careers, and we have to correct that. And although what I would say is the number of, I did check the UCAS stats just before coming on, and it looks like there are very, very small, minor incremental growth in the number of women going into university degrees studying computer science, but it's still very small. It sort of went 19%, 20%, 21%. We have to educate people at an earlier age as to why computing and digital skills are important. We have to review that curriculum. And also, as we go through that, it's not just the digital skills, but to your point, it's also entrepreneurship. That whenever you see a criticism of people, especially working in venture capital, which, let's think about it, that's by and large, that's going to be, most of these trillion-dollar companies will probably come from a venture-backed investment. Most people are complaining about Europe. It's not just a British thing, but in the UK and in Europe, we are generally seen as much more risk averse than our friends in the US. That the way that they are set up for investment, their celebration of success and failure is very different to the culture that we have. So there's very little, from a manifesto point of view, there is very little in there. There was actually good. I think they picked up around supporting research in universities, which I think is very important, but there was very little that really spoke to training digital skills, training entrepreneurship, which are the foundational building blocks that lead us to a trillion-dollar company. You can't just say, well, let's invite foreign investment and get a trillion-dollar company. It doesn't work like that.
No, I completely agree. Just having an MBA is not enough to build something like, well, Amazon or Google. You're completely
Absolutely.
right. We're running a bit short on time. I'm using the very fancy clock behind you for my timekeeping. So let's talk about perhaps what I think is going to be Labour's first big rebellion from their backbench, which is their plans to make it easier to get planning permission for data centres. Now you've got, let's be honest, home counties and other areas of the country. There's a lot of NIMBYs, a lot of people who don't want any big planning or building near them. And they're represented in Parliament by their MPs, the vast majority of whom now are Labour. So that's going to be potentially difficult for Labour to get through. It could be, as I say, the first sort of backbench rebellion, but it is important. What are your views on that one, Mark?
It is important, but I thought it was a bonkers manifesto promise. I literally I looked at this and thought that's such a random thing when all of those things we've just talked about, education, entrepreneurship, healthcare, the NHS, did all of those things which maybe aren't as represented as we thought. They said we're going to make it easier to, literally stated,
It was a
we'll make
very
it easier to build
specific
data
promise,
centers.
yeah.
And I thought, are we really running out of data center space? Because one of the things, especially from an SME perspective, nobody that I have spoken to, well, actually one person, but out of all the people that I've spoken to, nobody is saying I really need some data center space. It is now you think, which region do I put my resources in with the hyperscale cloud provider that I'm using? And so I thought, I need to do some digging into this because I wasn't aware there was an absolute crisis in data center space in the UK. Now, from the statistics that we've seen, and these are from companies like CBRE, so they have some bias in them. There is um, there are figures which suggest that I think over the next 4 years, there's a 31% increase in revenue in the UK from selling data center space. So 31% over 4 years, it's compound annual growth rate of 6 or 7%, something like that. Okay, well that's tracking up year on year. But at the same time, we're also seeing statements that say we're going to need a six-fold increase, 6 times increase in power because computing for machine learning for AI tools, generative AI tools, is so much more compute intensive that we need a six-fold increase. So I don't know how you square the circle for this. It seems utterly bizarre. We're saying we need to create more data center space, which is at a premium. So we are our usage of capacity has increased. We have less available space. But also, I went back and checked a data center that I used about 10 years ago is now being advertised as being under capacity versus new data centers. So, how about refitting those data centers so that they can have higher capacities? When obviously the problem becomes you can't supply enough power. So, this goes back to I don't really think that they have followed the chain of reasoning through that says, oh, of course, we'll make it easier to build data centers. Fine, that's great. But that's not your biggest blocker. Six-fold increase in data center power consumption is going to be a problem. So then, let's maybe talk about Great British Energy off the back of that. So I thought it
Yes.
was a bizarre promise. Yes, it's fine. No small businesses, and let's face it, the UK is primarily SMEs, are sitting there saying, I'm really worried about the amount of data center space that I've got. I'm sure the hyperscale cloud providers are. But I think there are other alternatives than just it seemed like an utterly bizarre place to put your chips in your manifesto promises.
Yeah, it was a very specific promise compared to the much sort of wider ranging, more nebulous things throughout the rest of the manifesto.
Yeah,
And you are right, like data centers are important, but they're not great for any local communities. They suck up lots of water and lots of power. Uh, so it might make more sense, instead of building them in our temperate climate here, it might make more sense to build them in the Nordics, where cooling is easier, or in somewhere like I don't know, somewhere they get a lot of solar power. Ecuador, I
yeah.
think, has quite a lot of data centers in Brazil, where they have a lot of renewables. So yeah, rather than trying to corner that market, maybe we should be looking at some other way to attract foreign direct investment.
Yeah,
But yeah,
absolutely right.
let's
And I was going to say quickly, there are other technologies which should make data centers more effective, more effective both in footprint and in power consumption, like immersion cooling, that drastically uh, decreases the energy consumption because cooling is such a large part of data center power consumption itself. Obviously, air cooling is very inefficient. So maybe we could look at investment in science research that leads to those things. And quite rightly, as you say, I do think there is a tension between owning our own infrastructure and making sure that we can stand on our own and having homegrown technology versus let's put this as far away as we can where there's lots of sun. And remember, the UK is one of the biggest producers of renewable energy from offshore power. So I think there are ways to do this. Microsoft, recently shut down. I think Penny Horwood covered this in Computing recently about Microsoft quietly shutting down its undersea data center. But I think there are other alternatives. It's just what a weird promise to make in the manifesto.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, let's okay. So before we close out with our hopes for the next 5 years or however long Labour are in power, let's very briefly talk about green tech and Labour's plans for Great British Energy. What is that going to mean for the tech sector?
It's difficult to say. I did see that most of the promises that were made in the manifesto were primarily not around digital businesses, so they were around areas like energy or manufacturing. So the high tech digital sector, by which I mean that we're not actually producing, manufacturing something, had very lightweight pledges. I do strongly believe that potentially coming close to the renationalisation. I know it's a touchy phrase to use, but the renationalisation of some of the critical infrastructure makes a huge amount of sense. We've seen that there are businesses like EDF in France, like the massive sovereign wealth funds in Norway, where it is very apparent that nation state-owned infrastructure can be extremely beneficial. So personally, I can't say whether I think it is going to be a success or not. I think that is a very sound move, as long as we can ensure that those utilities are effectively run when they are state-owned or close to state-owned. And I think that's the difficult line that will need to be trodden, which is, can we ensure that we have the real operators, the people that bring the expertise that is necessary to have world-leading utilities. So I think, Great British Power, Great British Energy is a fantastic idea in principle. As with almost everything else that we have said, it comes down to the execution of it.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're basically out of time here, so let's go on to talk about our hopes for the future. If you don't mind, Mark, I'm going to kick off with my ones. Uh, so I'm a child of the 2008 recession. It was my first job out of university. I'd been in it for about 2 months, and then recession. Uh, so and then of course a few years after that, Brexit, and then COVID. I've had three once in a generation events in my career. I think I've pretty much permanently worked in recession. So what I'm really hoping for is no more austerity. I would like to see no more cuts to public services. That would be great. I would like them to boost the economy by spending and investment in the tech sector. Ideally, that would be great. I think, as we were just talking about, the green tech sector is ripe for investment, but also the skills. So education and training, and not just at the starting level, at the primary, secondary, tertiary education, but reskilling people who are in, non-tech careers who want to then transition into a tech background, adults. So I think that would be very important. We've seen already there are some plans for that. They talk about it in the manifesto, the National Wealth Fund. So that's one. And my pie in the sky one is that they managed to centralize NHS tech, but who knows how successful they'll be with that. Mark, what are you hoping for?
I think to that question, I was thinking about this earlier. I would say I'm hopeful, but not necessarily optimistic. So I allowed myself to be briefly delighted by the result. Not necessarily because of the politics, but actually because of a change of management. And I think that removing the Conservative government after so long, where we have seen cronyism, mismanagement that verges on malicious incompetence at times, is extremely important. I do actually hope that the Conservative Party manages to take some time to reflect and rebuild itself, because I do think that it is very important that we have a really strong national debate with centrist, left and right represented. And I was also very, very, very pleased to see the Lib Dems having such a great showing. I just think that having a more balanced set of parties that can represent different policies, and I think Sir Ed Davey did a fantastic job diving into ponds
Bungee jumping
to
and
get
getting
that
shot out of a
bungee
cannon,
jumping. So, like I said, I am hopeful but not optimistic, because I think the scale of the challenge that Labour have inherited is absolutely enormous. Going back to that IFS report on their manifesto, it made it very clear that they have no wiggle room. They are talking about growth as the way that they will pull the entire country out of this situation, as you quite rightly say, consistent decline. And it's very, very depressing to see the UK decline as much as it has. Brexit was this enormous self-inflicted wound. So what I do hope is that we can start rebuilding the fundamentals. And I would just echo what you said, Tom. I think that the problems that we have need to be addressed right at the foundations first. I could wax lyrical about, you could make it more attractive to have venture capital investment in the UK, but I don't think that's the problem. There was a Rishi Sunak quote which I did think was really really pointed, really, really appropriate, where he said that the closest thing that we have to a magic bullet to improve life outcomes is education. I'm slightly misquoting him, but I actually agree with that. I think fundamentally we need to address problems at the source. If we want to have an entrepreneurial, high-tech country that is wildly successful, we need to educate the next generation with the skills that they need. If we want to have a happy, healthy nation, we need to invest in healthcare that prevents negative health outcomes rather than addresses them when they have become serious issues. So we need a happier, healthier, better educated country. So we have to invest in rebuilding the NHS and ensuring that our the next generation is educated in the skills that they need. So all those other points that you made are absolutely fantastic, but it has to be invest in the foundations and try not to sell off the remaining assets that we have to foreign investors.
Yeah, I think one previous Labour Prime Minister said it best: education, education, education. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
And on that note, we are out of time. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. I've been Tom Allen and joined by my guest, Mark Ridley. This is Control Alt Lead. Please do give us a review and subscribe. It really helps us out as a new podcast. And visit computing.co.uk for more information. And we'll see you again very soon.